Hello and welcome to Unstress and the Summer Series for 2021. What a year 2020 has been, and we have curated some episodes which we think were particularly relevant to what has been going on. I hope you're having a great break. Looking forward to the new year and catching up then. Until then, hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Unstress. I'm Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, a subject I've discussed in my own book and I think is relevant to every one of us is public health messages. How do they come about? What's the evidence to support them? What impact do they have on individual, community, public, and in fact global health? Well, not surprisingly, they play a huge role in our health at every level. My guest today is Dr. Zoe Harcombe, PhD, a researcher, an author, a blogger, a public speaker in the field of diet and health. Her particular areas of interest and expertise are public health dietary guidelines, especially dietary fat, nutrition, and obesity. Zoe got a BA and a master's degree from Cambridge University in economics and maths, so she understands numbers, statistics, and analysis, and the impact of all of those on public health. And she understands the nuances of research. Do the numbers stack up? In 2015, she released a bestseller, The Obesity Epidemic, What Caused It, How Can We Stop It? And that prompted her to do a PhD, which she got in 2016 in public health nutrition. Her thesis was on the actual evidence for the introduction of dietary fat recommendations during those critical years from 1977 to 1983, which still affect public health messages to this very day. Now, if you're looking for the most significant public health message, then the low-fat hypothesis, espoused, that is telling us to eat everything low-fat, and demonizing fat, espoused by almost every supposedly reputable health organization and authority, and then almost every health practitioner for the last 40 years, then this would have to be it. It is the public health message to end, I hope that's just to not to end all public health messages, but it's had a tremendous impact. And if the evidence is anything to go by, it was a major contributor to set us up for the epidemic of preventable chronic degenerative diseases and arguably the environmental degradation that has occurred to this very day. There is so much we talk about. Obviously, dietary guidelines and the evidence for it. The propaganda behind the plant-based dietary recommendations we are hearing so much about today, cholesterol and heart disease, and much, much more. I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Dr. Zoe Harcombe. Welcome to the show, Zoe.
Hi, Ron. Thanks so much for having me on.
Zoe, I first followed your conversations on the group that is called the Cholesterol Skeptics. I think it's called Thinks. The International Network of Cholesterol Skeptics, and of course we might talk about that because I always thought the contributors were amazing and the information was amazing, and all of that, and that's where I first came in contact with your contributions there, which I also thought were quite incredible. But I was wondering if you might share with us your story because it's a really interesting one, and maybe you could share that with our listener.
Yeah, sure. It didn't actually start off in anything to do with cholesterol, but it started off with a fascination with obesity, and it was as simple as I'm a mathematician by background, and logic is really, really important to me, as you've probably worked out from my newsletters. But what didn't make sense was that I've never met anyone who wants to be overweight, let alone obese, and yet 2/3 of the developed world are, and that's obviously Australia, New Zealand, UK, US, I think even sort of places like France and Spain and countries that follow the so-called Mediterranean diet, they're catching up rapidly as well. And it just makes no sense because nobody wants to be obese. So why do we have this obesity epidemic? And if the solution is as simple as eat less, do more, then why don't people just do that? And that's what I started looking at back at university, to be honest, because the epidemic was starting to gather pace in the early 90s. And then, of course, by the end of the last century, we had 25% obesity, let alone overweight, in the UK, and the US was ahead of that, and I think Australia and New Zealand were catching up at that time.
We're up there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is all the developed nations. And you try to understand what caused that. And for something to change, something must change. It's a basic principle in science. If you do nothing to change a circumstance, then nothing changes. So you start looking at what changed. And did we start eating more? Actually, no, we didn't. And if you look at some of the evidence from government literature, certainly in the UK, if not in other nations, we're actually eating fewer calories than we were back at the time when we didn't have this obesity epidemic. Are we doing less? I don't think we are. I never used to see anyone jogging or cycling or running marathons or joining gyms or whatever when I was a kid. Everybody's doing it now. Everybody seems to be trying to run off something that they shouldn't have eaten. And about the only thing that I've ever come across that did actually change was our dietary guidelines. Now, I'm really happy for somebody to put forward another hypothesis, because it isn't that we ate more and did less. It really isn't. The evidence just doesn't show that. And Gary Taubes came to the same conclusion in Good Calories, Bad Calories. But what did change is our dietary guidelines, and we started eating differently. We didn't necessarily start eating more, but we started eating differently, and we started eating really badly. And that seems to be what coincided with the obesity epidemic. So that then became my fascination to try to understand, why did we change our dietary guidelines? What did we change them to? And was that change evidence-based? And, of course, that ended up being the base of my PhD.
Yes, what a great I mean, really, I think you've struck right at the heart of the problem. And so often we whenever we hear about nutrition or poor nutrition, we always have images of hamburgers and hot dogs and chips and pizzas. But I think largely I share the view that the food pyramid set us up for failure and was perhaps the biggest nutritional stress we've had to encounter. Tell us about because your PhD was actually on that. Tell us a little bit about that, because it's very relevant to this conversation.
It is, because when you see that the change in the dietary guidelines literally coincided with the start of the obesity epidemic. So you look at the famous graph that comes from N. Haynes in the US, and it's got that kink where obesity just takes off like an airplane. And it takes off at about 1976 to 1980. And, of course, the dietary guidelines were introduced in 1977 in the US. And then the UK followed suit in 1983. And then pretty much the rest of the world all came out with their own plates and pyramids. But they were so very much based on one principle, which was base your meals on starchy foods. And we get told to, I remember having a look at the Australian advice once, we get told to have sort of 6 to 11 starchy food portions on a daily basis. Now, I enjoy being slim. I find it really easy to stay slim. I can absolutely guarantee if I followed that advice, I wouldn't be slim for more than a week. Why would you tell people to eat the stuff that fattens cattle? Why would you tell people to eat the stuff that you use to fatten geese to provide foie gras, fatty liver? I mean, it makes no sense. And the thing, I think one of the things that people don't realize if they're not familiar with nutrition, there's only 3 things that we can eat: carbohydrate, fat, and protein. And then a little known fact is that in any natural diet, we tend to eat approximately 15% protein. It actually doesn't much matter whether it's a vegetarian natural diet or a omnivore natural diet. If you look at the evidence from the Pure study right across the world, you are looking at pretty much an average of 15% intake of protein. So as soon as you set a dietary fat guideline restriction, is a better description, of 30% fat, the only thing that's left to take up the slack is carbohydrate. So you immediately, in setting that dietary fat restriction, tell people have a minimum of 55% of your diet in the form of carbohydrate. And as I say at conferences, we never tested that. We never knew that that would be safe, let alone healthy. We really didn't know. We just inflicted this experiment on the developed world. The undeveloped world eats carbs because they can't afford anything better, and then we were told to eat carbs because somehow we should fear fat. So my PhD was trying to understand, was the evidence there to damn fat? And I thought there would be some evidence there. I mean, you shouldn't go into a PhD expecting anything. You should go in completely open-minded. But if someone had held a gun to my head and said, you're going to be studying this for 3 years, you've actually been studying it at some level for many years already, what do you think you're going to find? I thought, I'm going to find some evidence for heart disease because it was in the name of heart disease that we introduced the dietary fat guidelines, but maybe on balance, other things haven't turned out so well. So, maybe it wasn't such a good idea on balance. I found nothing. I found absolutely no evidence whatsoever that those dietary fat guidelines should have been introduced. And that was using systematic review and meta-analysis of both randomized control trials and epidemiological population cohort studies, whatever you want to call them, did the most rigorous analysis of all the evidence, looking at the evidence that was available at the time the guidelines were introduced, which was the novel bit of the PHC, and then looking at the evidence available today. And the interesting thing about the second part is I'm obviously not the only person to have done that, because you've got people like Hooper, Schwing-Shackle and Hoffman, Siri Torino, Skiaf and Miller. You've got a lot of people who've looked at randomized controlled trials in meta-analysis, best available evidence that we can have. And that was the really interesting well, there were so many interesting findings, but that was one of the most interesting ones, that when other people had looked at the same literature that I had done, there were 37 out of 40 non-findings, as in on 37 out of 40 different investigations, the researchers found nothing. So I wasn't alone in finding nothing. When you then look at the three, because you think, okay, there were three findings. One was against trans fats, no argument. Let's all agree that's horrible. And two fell away when subjected to sensitivity analysis. So the two findings against, I think it was saturated fat for cardiovascular disease events, which was the only small niche finding, fell away under sensitivity analysis. So 39 out of 40 findings have found nothing whatsoever against total fat or saturated fat or swapping out saturated fat and swapping in polyunsaturated fat. All the stuff that we're told to do, there is no evidence for.
It's mind-boggling. It's absolutely mind-boggling, and I'm actually familiar with this story, and I'm sure a lot of my listeners are. But for the vast majority of the population who feel a public health message is a public health message endorsed by governments and regulatory bodies and professional bodies, because that's exactly what has happened, how did we get it so wrong?
Oh dear, that's probably the $1 million question, isn't it? I think a lot actually
That's
goes
probably
back
the answer,
to...
Zoe. That's probably the answer.
Yeah, it probably is actually. Excuse me, it's early in the morning here. Tickly cough. Gosh, I think it's been quite well documented in books by people like Nina Teicholz, Big Fat Surprise, and also Denise Minger, The Death of the Food Pyramid. And I think you have to go back to some of the anecdotal evidence at the time. And the guy who was behind the introduction of the 1977 guidelines, which we then just all followed, was, of course, Senator George McGovern, who was a failed presidential candidate. They then want to go on and make their mark in a different way, as is the want of failed presidential candidates. And I think the most important thing is that Senator McGovern had just been on a low-fat Pritikin-style boot camp. So he was coming into setting the guidelines with a prejudice, with a bias of actually having just done this very low-fat boot camp, and depending on what his diet was like before, what we tend to see when people move to a whole food plant-based diet is if they've been on the standard American diet, they actually feel better quite quickly because the standard American diet is so bad. The whole food plant-based diet isn't going to be good long-term because it's got nutritional deficiencies, but it's just the whole food element that makes the difference. So let's say Senator George had been having the normal standard American diet. Then he goes on this boot camp, which is no doubt going to be whole foods, nicely cooked fruits and vegetables and legumes and whatever. And he probably did feel a bit better, and he probably did lose a few pounds. And then he goes straight into the government committee where he's setting the guidelines for 200 Americans and 50 million Brits we're going to follow at the same time. And he's got a bias. And there's documented evidence. There's a great clip in the Tom Norton movie, Fathead, the movie, when he shows the clip of Robert Olson pleading with the senator, saying, "Senator, please, we do not have the evidence to unleash this experiment on the American people." And Senator McGovern's reply is, "Oh, it's all right for you academics. You've got all the time in the world. Us politicians, we don't. We need to do something, and I'm doing something, so get over it." And that was essentially the exchange between the two.
But of course, industry picked up and ran with it, didn't they?
Oh, massively advantageous to industry, music to the ear of industry. I mean, practically the only industry that has a good lobby that might have suffered in some way was probably dairy. But then dairy could adapt and say, okay, so if you're going low-fat, then we'll go low-fat dairy. They certainly weren't demonized then in the way that they are today, because, of course, now the world, it's not. Vegans are punching way above their weight in terms of numbers. They're still probably only 1%. They're just making a lot of noise at the moment, and they'll get sick very quickly, so they'll make less noise because they won't feel well enough to make noise.
We're going to touch on vegan. We're going to touch on vegan.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah.
But, I mean, at the time, dairy didn't mind so much because they could go low-fat dairy, and then, of course, the whole low-fat, high-sugar yogurt industry came up, the low-fat, high-sugar dessert. So dairy was okay. Cereal companies were thrilled to bits, and let's face it, the cereal companies have had a hand in sponsoring the kind of people that get behind the guidelines. You just need to look at the work of Belinda Fettke if you've got any doubt over that. So the cereal relationship goes back to the Seventh-day Adventists, the 1860s, and you should have lots of fibre because fibre is purging and men are sinful and all the rest of it. I mean, it's scary, scary, scary stuff. But that's the root of why cereal has done so well. And, of course, in Australia, with Sanitarium, you've got the ultimate religious cereal organisation trying to get the population to have cereal for breakfast instead of eggs, which is what people probably should be having for breakfast, or yogurt, or steak, or bacon, or whatever you fancy. And then, of course, the ready meal came in, the snack came in, because you're hungry. If you have cereal for breakfast, you're going to want something at 11 a.m. And, yeah, the manufacturers loved it, and they've loved it ever since, and they've become more and more embedded in keeping these guidelines going, despite the consequences being fairly obvious.
And they have kept going, haven't they? Have they come up? You mentioned plates and all this. I mean, in Australia, we have the Australian Healthy Eating Guidelines. I think that came out in 2013. It was really just a slight variation on the plate and the pyramid. This sort of thing is not. I've often said this isn't going away easy, quickly, because there's just too much at stake here, isn't there?
There is. There really is, and that's the difficult thing. You've got a lot of people now invested in it. You've got public health experts, so-called. So we would have somebody like the chief medical officer. We'd have one for England. We'd have one for Wales. You've got Public Health England, Public Health Wales. You've got these public health bodies where you've got so-called experts who have been giving out this advice for a long period of time. They don't want to look stupid by saying, hey, I'm really sorry, but I've been telling you the wrong stuff personally for the last 5-10 years, however long they've been in post. And governments don't want to say, look, I'm terribly sorry, we've been giving you the wrong advice for 40 years. And potentially there could be lawsuits. There could be large class action suits. You made me obese, you made me type 2 diabetic. We haven't made the strongest connections yet with cancer and heart disease, but it might only be a matter of research being needed to show that actually it hasn't helped either of those chronic conditions either. And you've got the vested interest. So you've got companies that stand to do very well by continuing these guidelines.
Yeah, I know. It's such a great economic model. The problem is it's just not a very good health model, and so many reputations are built on it. But I wonder if I guess the connection there between public health messages and industry, I think this is another one that people. I know we see it a lot in environmental medicine, where people just assume if a chemical is on the shelf in a product, then it's been tested, so it's all fine. And I think the majority of the population take that view, isn't it?
I think they do, and it's really funny because I've just retweeted someone who's just done the funniest tweet ever. She's put up the ingredients of the Beyond Meat burger versus the Impossible burger versus dog food. And you should see this tweet. It's just so funny because you can't tell the difference. It's just 3 lists of concoctions: protein, concentrate, oils, natural flavours, ho, potato protein, methyl cellulose, yeast extract, cultured dextrose, and multidextrose multidextrin is always in these things. And then, of course, nutrients, because the natural product has no nutritional value whatsoever. So you've then got added niacin, B12, this, that, and the other, because you've got to put it in. But it does just read like a chemistry set, and you can't tell the difference between real food and pet food. That shouldn't be. You shouldn't be putting something in your body. I used to say, if I walked up to you in a supermarket and showed you a white pill and said, take that, I mean, 100 people out of 100 would say, well, what is it? I'm not just going to take a pill. It could be arsenic or something. And then you point out that I can absolutely guarantee that there will be a product in your shopping trolley that has an ingredient that you don't know what it is, and yet you're just going to take it home and put it in your mouth. Why aren't you more questioning? But people just don't think. What you say is exactly right. People trust that our public health authorities have our best interests at heart. I don't think they do. I think they have big companies' interests at heart.
Yes, I think that's one of the reasons why people are becoming so disillusioned with government. I think it's the fact that you take a step back and think, well, what is the government there for? Well, is it for the public health, or is it for maintaining corporate profits? And I think, sadly, I think the second one comes up, Trump's, I hate to use that term, I'm sorry, but, it comes out on top too often. And then I think people are feeling a bit disillusioned with it about that. But let's set the record a little bit straight here, Zoe, because I know you've looked at different diets, and I thought I'd be very interested just to get a little bit of a, comment from you about a couple of pluses and minuses of each of these. And I thought I must start with the carnivore diet because, we're always going to lob in on the vegans and the vegetarians. But why don't we start with the carnivore diet? What do you know about that? What do you think about that?
It seems to be working for some people, and you can't knock that. So I'm very much of the view that people are individuals, and you've got people, so for example, Jordan Peterson, Michaela Peterson, Georgia Reed. There are people that I've met. I've certainly met Georgia. I haven't met Michaela or Jordan, although I think I will probably meet Michaela on the conference circuit at some point because she's on that. Been in comms with her anyway. There are people for whom it works, and you just can't knock that. I get really annoyed when people are so judgmental. I mean, the articles that have been written about Michaela and Jordan following this diet and how dangerous it is, and what is it? How dare you think you've got the right to comment on someone else's diet, particularly with somebody like Michaela and Jordan. I don't know Georgia's history so much. I do know she's had terrible, terrible problems trying to feel healthy, and this is the one thing that has made her feel healthy. But you look at Michaela's history with the chronic joint problems that she's had, and the number of operations that she'd had before she'd even reached adulthood, and she found something that is making her feel well for the first time in her life and free from depression as well as the physicalities. It's just like, columnists, get out of here. Leave her alone. Let her do what she wants to do. I really object to sort of the way that people go into other people's diets and feel that they've got a right to comment on them. Somebody says, oh, I'm a fruitarian or something. And everyone will wade in and give their own opinion on that. I mean, do what you want to do. In my opinion, you'll suffer ill health quite quickly. But if that's what you want to try and you have to find it out for yourself, then go try it. You're a grown-up. Just what I do get mad at is when people inflict things on children. And so when you've got a vegan diet, for example, being inflicted on children, then I get annoyed because you are harming your child. And that's pretty serious. But a carnivore diet, I would hate it. I would absolutely hate it.
Is it just that? Is it literally just carnivore? It's not eating any vegetables, not eating any grains.
No, it is absolutely just meat. And for some people, it's not nose to tail meat. It's just particular meat. So I happen to know Georgia, there are some meats that she doesn't get on with. So it's not even all meat. I can't remember. I have dined with her, but I can't remember. I think we had lamb at the time that she was with us, so I know that lamb is okay for her. And it might be lamb is okay, but beef and pork aren't, or something like that. So for some people, they are just eating, I think Sean pretty much just eats steak, Sean Baker. I don't think he's looking to eat pig's trotters or liver or things like that.
When you think about it, and I've done a few programs on various aspects of vegetables, You know, there are a few things in vegetables that could actually be, well, they are very irritating. Salicylates, phytates,
Yeah,
FODMAPs, oxalates,
yeah.
gluten. I mean, vegetables are pretty dangerous,
Yeah,
potentially.
Georgia does some great work on this, actually, and Leah Keith, so the Vegetarian Myth, does some great work on this, actually. And both of them, Leah, I think, describes plants as opioids or something, or yeah, just plants generally, because plants have the carbohydrate base, as opioids that try desperately not to be eaten. They put out signals so that we don't eat them, and then we eat them anyway. It's a difficult one to say that we're not intended to eat them. I mean, we have this whole debate, what have we evolved to eat? I absolutely believe if there's any animal we could ever have caught, fish or land-based or whatever, we would have eaten it, because it would just be too rich in nutrients for us not to eat it. And similarly, when you look at plants, they do bring some things to the party, nothing that you can't get in animal foods. But if you didn't catch an animal and you could find some nuts or some berries or some plants that were non-toxic, at the time you would have eaten them. And a lot of people are okay with plants. I think, again, it's about not being too general and recognising individuals. So FODMAPs, I think, is a really interesting area that some people need to know about, because I, for example, would be really fine eating pretty much any vegetables, no problems eating any of them. I've got friends and family who really aren't so okay with the FODMAP kind of vegetables. So when they get into the more cruciferous vegetables, cauliflower, maybe even onion, in fact quite often onion and garlic, are not so good. And if you know that something doesn't agree with you, for some people it's tomatoes, then it makes sense not to eat it. Now, it's unfortunate if you're one of the people who just can't tolerate any plants. I mean, as Michaela says, I don't do this for fun. If you think this is fun, well, I can't go out and dine normally with my friends and eat what my friends are eating and eat what everyone around me is eating. You don't do this because this is fun. You have to recognise the benefit that she must get from eating in that way, given what she's giving up to have to do it. On balance, it just shows you how powerful that diet must be for her, that she's prepared to do it. I can't think of the circumstances in which you could say to me, right, you're only going to eat meat for the rest of your life, and no fruit, no yogurt, no dairy, no cappuccinos, no dark chocolate, no veggie curry, no croissant once in a while, because they're nice
Stop,
in
Zoe,
Europe.
stop. You're obviously just at the beginning of your day. I've already had dinner here in Australia.
Oh, there you go. So you won't want any of that then.
No. But
That'd be misery to me.
yeah, no, absolutely. And given her, I mean, I think she was suffering really badly from rheumatoid arthritis, rheumatic sort of joint problems and all this. So clearly, I mean, this whole idea of listening to your body and customizing it, is a really important aspect of our health journey, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And do you know what? I think the average person following the standard American diet, the prescribed Australian diet, I don't think they realise just how well they could feel. Now, I was up in London last week, and we don't have so many people down in Wales where I live. There are more people in London by a factor of 4 than in the whole of Wales. So you're just on the tube with so many people, in a crowded area with so many people. And you just glance around, and the average person looks so ill. It's not true. They look pale, they look tired, they slump, they don't seem to have the muscular structure to stand up well. They're clearly not exercising on a regular basis. They're clearly not eating well. Their hair isn't shining and glossy. And you just look around and think, what are you guys doing? And you just want to say to them, you have no idea how well you could feel if I could just get you off that diet that has been prescribed, that you think has been prescribed honestly, that you don't realise the food companies were appointed to prescribe, because that's what happens in the UK. Public Health England put together a panel to come up with our latest dietary advice, which happened in March 2016, and they appointed representatives, you just almost can't believe this, from the Food and Drink Federation, the Association for Convenience Stores, which is basically the corner shop that sells the sausage rolls and the rubbish and the crisps and the confectionery, and it's 5 industry reps, basically. British Nutrition Foundation, that's an industry rep, it's not a nutrition organisation. And people don't realise that. And you want to say to them, if I could just get you onto whole food just as a starter, I actually don't really mind if that's plant-based or animal-based. Animal-based would be healthier, but let me just get you off rubbish. And then if you ever went back to eating rubbish, you would feel so ill so quickly. You would realize that white flour and sugar makes you feel so ill so quickly. You're at this sort of just low-level malaise the whole time. You're just feeling rubbish and tired the whole time, and you don't even realize it. If we could get you out of that, you would then have a severe reaction when you have flour and sugar, and it would make you realize you don't want to go back to that. But people are just living with this background of just feeling rubbish.
So did I get that right? The panel that were determining the British dietary guidelines were basically very heavily influenced, or, you know, the people on the panel were from industry.
Yeah, so I'm just pulling up the slide now, actually. So I've got it. So I put up this slide where I show organisations, you know them there as well, McDonald's, PepsiCo, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, Nestle, Mars, Kellogg's, which is our equivalent of your sanitarium.
Yeah, we've
and
got
then you've
Kellogg's
got our major grocers, and then you've got British Sugar, Tate & Lyle, which is a sugar-making company, McCain, which makes oven chips, Iceland, which just basically makes rubbish, frozen chicken nuggets and all that kind of stuff. All of those were just the members of one of the organisations. So they put together a panel of 11 people, and 3 of them just never turned up. I checked all the original minutes, and they just didn't turn up. So we're effectively down to a panel of 8. All 8 of those had conflicts. One was a rep from the British Dietetic Association. Of course, they've got conflicts, and the Australian dietitians had conflicts for many years. They're trying to disassociate themselves from those conflicts now, but that's going to take a long time to trickle through. So essentially all the 8 had conflicts, but 5 were actually industry reps. So the 5 industry bodies were the Institute of Grocery Distribution, British Nutrition Foundation, which is the who's who of the fake food industry, British Retail Consortium, ditto, Food and Drink Federation, ditto, and the Association of Convenience Stores. Now, the latter, you think about that as if you've ever been to the UK, there is a corner store on every street. There's a little newsagent that sells newspapers and crisps and confectionery, ice cream and fizzy drinks, and absolutely nothing healthy. And at the time they were on this panel putting together the so-called healthy eating guidelines, that Association of Convenience Stores was also fighting government legislation to put cigarettes in plain packaging, because obviously their convenience stores didn't want that to happen, because they wanted people to go in and buy cigarettes because they make good money on cigarettes. So this is not a body that cares about human health in any shape or form. And yet there they were as one of the dominant panel members putting together our Eat Badly plate, as I call it. I'm famed for calling it the Eat Badly plate, not the Eat Well plate, or Eat Well Guide, I think it became.
Yeah, no. I've looked at the corporate sponsorships of some pretty major corporations, you know, health bodies in Australia and in America and in the UK, and it's a pretty sad story when you look at it, and you've just mentioned exactly that. But getting back to another diet, and we've already kind of mentioned it, and you've mentioned some problems with it, and they are punching a bit above their weight, and that is the vegan diet. Tell us what's your assessment of the vegan diet and the vegan movement? What's going on?
Yeah, it's very interesting, actually. So the vegan diet, because of the whole food aspect, it's what I said earlier. So if anybody moves from a standard prescribed government diet to a whole food vegan diet, they will actually feel better, because they've got rid of the worst aspect of what makes us feel unwell, which is processed food. And they stop eating things like gummy bears and Haribo because they contain gelatin. And they probably stop drinking because a lot of drink is processed using fish scales. So there's just a lot of rubbish that you cut out. There's almost no cakes, biscuits, confectionery that don't have animal foods at some level. So they might base their meals on whole grains and vegetables and fruits and legumes. And in the short term, that is actually better than the standard diet that they were on. But it is nutritionally deficient. So there are certain nutrients, and it's not just B12. There are a number of nutrients that you can only get in animal foods. So sort of going through in order, you can only get retinol which is the form of vitamin A that the body wants from animal foods. D3 is the form of vitamin D that the body wants. K2 you can get from fermented foods, but it's essentially coming from animal foods. Heme iron only found in certain animal foods, red meat and seafood essentially, or meat generally, red meat particularly. B12, of course, is only found in animal foods. That's the one thing that vegans tend to acquiesce on and admit, yes, okay, we've got to have B12 injections every now and again. Omega-3 in the right form, DHA and EPA, they try to say, well, we can eat a shed load of algae and it can have the same impact as us eating the fish who have processed the algae for us. Good luck with that one. I'm not convinced. If you want to risk your brain health on that one, that's your call. Choline you can get from some plant foods, but it's a heck of a lot easier if you've got eggs in your diet. You're likely to be deficient in that one. And it's just fraught with nutritional deficiencies, even though, for example, you can get calcium from plant foods. It's extremely unlikely you're going to get enough if you're not eating oily fish or dairy, which are particularly rich sources of calcium. And there does seem to be a view, particularly with young vegans, they just think, okay, I can go vegan, it's going to be good for me, it's going to be good for the planet. And they just don't think at all what the consequences could be, what the deficiencies could be, what they should be doing to make sure that they're not going to be nutritionally deficient. And we've even had some of the ones that blog on YouTube who've had quite a following for going vegan, who've then, bless them, I mean, real great honesty, have gone out to their fan base and say, guys, I'm really sorry I've started eating eggs or fish because I just didn't feel well. I had to listen to my body, and my body was telling me to eat this. And there's nothing like the backlash that you get from vegans when you stop being vegan. It really has to be seen to be believed. I probably should declare at this point, actually, that I was vegetarian for 20 years.
Okay.
And actually, did lapse into veganism without realising. Now you think, how could you do that? I was in my 20s. I didn't know about nutrition what I know now. I was living with someone who was vegan, and I don't like cooking, and he did like cooking. And I just kind of didn't realise that every night we were having a vegan meal, and breakfast had sort of gone vegan because there wasn't milk in the fridge. I kind of didn't really think anything of it. It's like, okay, you can have porridge with water. What's the problem? Or there's lots of fruit. That's nice. I'll have some fruit, or I'll just have some dry toast. Or I just wasn't thinking about it. And I ended up having 2 eye operations that I think now, looking back, were connected to that lapse into veganism without realising, because I wasn't getting retinol. And a number of people are not good converters from carotene, the plant form of vitamin A, to retinol, the animal form of vitamin A, and maybe I was one of those. And generally just didn't feel good and just didn't make the connection. And then a coffee thing opened up at my workplace. I love cappuccinos. And I just started drinking milk. So even though I was vegan at sort of breakfast and dinner, I was having a good amount of milk in between in the day, and then just suddenly started feeling better. And I can look back with the knowledge that I've got now and realise what was going on, but I had no idea at the time. Didn't make those connections at all. So why would any 20-year-old vegan who thinks they're doing the right thing, why would they know anything about retinol or carotene or D3 or B12? They don't get taught that in school. They might get taught the food pyramid in school, which is of far less use to them than actually teaching them what the 13 vitamins are and the essential amino acids and the essential fats and where you get them. Gosh, how useful that would be. But we don't bother.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the fat makes you fat was a very easy message to convey to people because it made sense, didn't it? I mean, it was an easy, I just said it, fat makes you fat. I think that's 3 words there. Fat makes you fat, and people understand it. And, the ethics of animal agriculture is an easy one. And I actually, on this note, I agree with the vegans in that industrial animal agriculture, the CAFOs, the pens, the feedlots, I think that there is a problem with that. But the answer,
I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody realistically could argue with that. But to say I'm therefore rejecting all animal products as a result is kind of, again, oversimplistic in the same way that fat makes you fat was a bit oversimplistic, because, to think that it's environmentally friendly to monocrop, foods around the world, and all the wildlife and land that's cleared and chemicals that are used, etc., etc. It's just a little oversimplistic, isn't it?
Well, it is, and the way that the vegans movement has latched onto the environmental movement, it's almost created this perfect storm at the moment, out of which is coming stuff like the Eat Lancet diet. You've got these massive agri-chemical companies who would be quite happy if there were no topsoil left and they're left to control the food supply, because they're already working on it. They're already growing food upside down in greenhouses. They're already growing fake meat in laboratories, the Impossible Burger and Beyond Burger and all that kind of thing. The interesting thing is that the vegans are wrong on the nutrition. It is absolutely not healthier to be vegan than it is to be a whole food omnivore. And they're also wrong on the environmental thing. In fact, one of the two things that drove me back to eating meat, because I don't want to eat meat, my heart is against eating an animal. I really struggle with eating an animal, but I understand that it's what I must do for my health and for the planet health. And that's the thing that the vegans just don't seem to get. That we can only feed the world when we have topsoil. And in a lot of areas of the world at the moment where topsoil was once several feet deep, it's now inches deep, millimeters even. It is so thin. And I don't know if you can see it. We live in the countryside, so when it rains, and it rains all the time in Wales, the roads turn muddy brown because that's the soil washing off from the fields and just running down the road into the drains, where it will get screened out in the water processing system, and that's soil gone forever. And that's our topsoil gone forever. And vegan food does not give back to the land. Vegan food rapes the land. So as you say, growing these monocrops, putting soy beans in the field one year and then rapeseed for oil the next year, and then barley for bread or wheat or whatever the next year, that is just continually taken from the soil. The only thing in the food chain that gives back to the soil is ruminants, which will be cows, sheep, reindeer over here, including that as well. So what then comes from those in terms of, you've got beef and you've got dairy, you've got lamb, you've got sheep's dairy and goat's cheese, goat's milk, all that kind of thing. All of those food products that end up in the food chain give back to the land, because those animals, the ruminant characteristic is the four-stomach system, where they host billions of microflora and regurgitate it back onto the land. And of course they're weeing and pooing all the time and giving back to the land, and then eating the grass that they're weeing and pooing on. And it's just this incredible continuous cycle of life, hosting life and giving back to the soil. And the ideal soil system is actually what was developed in the English agricultural revolution, which was the free field system. So one year you have the animals in the field, the next year you grow crops in the field, and all the fabulous nutrition that has been laid down in the soil by the animals then goes into the plant food. We know that plants now have far less things like selenium and iron and nutrients that would naturally be found in plant foods in the ground, because the soil is just not of the quality that it was. And then the third year you actually leave the field fallow to recover from the crop that's just been planted. And then you put the animals back in, and they give back to the land, and then you plant the crop, and so on and so it goes. But of course today's modern manufacturers are so greedy, they will never leave a field fallow, and they don't want to put the animals in that field when they can be growing soya beans for vegans and rapeseed for rapeseed oil, which our governments tell us to have in preference to natural fats that come from those animals. It's just the most insane system. The single most insane thing we ever do is to rape the land, growing grains and soybeans to give to cattle who are kept in sheds in concrete, which is evil for the animal, and it's evil for the planet, and it's just evil for everyone. It's just horrible. That's the bit that we should universally agree has to go worldwide. You graze an animal outside, or you don't eat an animal or keep an animal at all. End of.
Well, Zoe, music to my ears and our listeners. We've covered regenerative agriculture is a very favourite topic of ours on this show, and I love that three-field system. When I think about it, how have we for thousands of years in in Britain, for example, or in Europe, continued the agricultural process, given the last 50 years, if we continued the way we're going. I mean, I've heard one estimate saying we only have 60 harvests left.
Yeah, I have as well. And it will be far fewer if we do more plant agriculture. If fewer people eat meat, that will only get worse. And particularly in countries like New Zealand, Wales, where we've just got natural lands for grazing lamb, particularly cattle as well. We don't need to put animals in sheds in those kind of countries because we need them to be grazing the land and looking after the grass. I mean, some people with big plots of land in Wales actually get in touch with the local farmer, and the local farmer will come round and say, okay, to keep that field so that you don't have to mow the grass every week, you're going to need 3 sheep or 10 sheep. And the farmer will actually say, this is how many sheep that you need in that field. And then they do a deal, which is a complete win-win. And the landowner will say, can you put 10 sheep in my field then? And they'll mow the grass for me. And the farmer has got 10 sheep fed. And somebody at the end of the garden looking out for those sheep. I mean, it's just such a win-win. We don't need to be putting them in sheds. I mean, that is just such a horrible thing to do. That's what we should unite. The omnivores, carnivores, and vegans should unite to end that practice worldwide. Compassion in world farming. But the answer is not going vegan. It really isn't. We'd all be so sick and we'd have no soil. And the only winners in that game are the agri-chemical companies like Cargill and Bayer and whatever else, who incidentally were the people behind the Eat Lancet diet.
I was going to ask you about that. You mentioned Eat Lancet, and our listener may not be aware of it, but it's often quoted. Can you just tell our listener a little bit about the Eat Lancet report and what your thoughts are on it?
Well, it came out in January of last year, so it's almost a year old now. I had a blog up within about an hour of seeing the report. I looked at, the diet was just so prescriptive. It was so acutely described. It was really quite incredible how, in what detail. I was just going to pull it up actually, get the little table up in front of me. So it went down to the level of you should have 232 grams a day of whole grains, rice, wheat, corn, and other, and that's going to give you 811 calories. I mean, just that was the detail that they put in. So one of the staggering details, they wanted you having about 450 calories of basically oils, palm oil, unsaturated oils, and so on, which is that fat at that level just doesn't bring anything to the table. Sometimes it's got some vitamin E, sometimes it's got some vitamin K, it's got no minerals, it's got no other vitamins of any nutritional quality. This is why it ended up being completely nutritionally deficient. And then perhaps the most staggering inclusion of all, they wanted people to have 120 calories a day of pure sugar. Wow. Of sucrose. I mean, yeah, it was just absolutely. So then when you
hang on, say that again, Zoe. 120 grams.
120 calories of what they called all sweeteners. So that has to be caloric sweeteners, which is basically, it could be honey, it could be sucrose, it could be high fructose corn syrup, but it's basically completely empty sugar calories. And then when you compare that to the fact that they wanted you to have 15 calories, ideally 0, but you could have up to 15 calories of beef and lamb, 15 calories of pork, 62 calories of chicken, 40 of fish, and 19 of eggs. So doing a quick tot up in my head, you'd be looking at, so beef, lamb, pork, chicken, other poultry, and fish. You're having slightly about the same calories from all of those food groups as they wanted you to have in pure sugar.
Wow.
So unsurprisingly, it ended up being deficient in a large number of nutrients, B12, iron, particularly severe in iron deficiency in women because, of course, women have a higher iron requirement, calcium, vitamin D. So I wrote a letter to the Lancet because they do allow letters to be published. They tend to publish them about 6 months after the article has been published, by which point it's hardly a rebuttal. It's long gone since been chip paper. They refused to publish that one because that was obviously not the kind of thing that they wanted alongside their lovely article that they had sponsored, remember. But then, of course, the organisations behind that Eat Lancet diet included the usual suspects: Nestle, PepsiCo, Kellogg's, Unilever. That's the same as in the UK one. Danone often crops up in these things. And then you've got sort of agri-food biotech companies like Cargill, Beulah, Bayer.
They were all contributors to this article.
They were all backers, basically. So there's an organisation called Fresh, which was jointly launched in January 2017 by the Eat Foundation and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, whoever the heck they are, and 25 founding member companies, and then the membership went up to about 40 companies. And those were basically the guys behind the Eat Lancet diet. And if you look at the individuals who were putting together the Eat Lancet diet, I think it was Nina Teicholz who had a look at the number who were personally vegan, and it's massively over-representative of the national population, shall we say. I mean, on a panel of 39 experts, which was the number of people putting together the Eat Lancet report, on the normal average, you'd be lucky if you had one vegan. You should have had not even half a vegan, but I think it was half or something, or maybe even more that were vegan or vegetarian.
Incredibly, I mean, The Lancet is supposedly a reputable journal by world standards in science and health, and yet here was what it amounted to little more than a very elegant commercial.
Yeah.
I mean, that's quite breathtaking, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, and I think then, I mean, it sounds so cynical, but I think you get to the point then that you trust nothing. Trust nothing, trust no one, which is actually, I think it's very healthy to have an inquisitive mind anyway, and I think the younger that people develop this, the better. You do tend to come across 18-year-olds, let's say people. I did a lot of graduate recruitment. My previous job, I was an HR director. My proper job, as my mum calls it. So I did a lot of graduate recruitment, and it's really interesting interviewing graduates because they have such a clear view of the world that essentially they have picked up from influential teachers who might have had quite a clear view of the world, or parents, if they're full of admiration for their parents. But if you probe their views, they don't stand up to scrutiny because they're actually not their own views. So they might be vegan, they might be advocates of a particular political policy, and when you probe it, it falls away so quickly because they don't know. They haven't researched it in depth. It's not a real belief. It's just something that they've picked up. And also, when you're younger, you tend to see the world in black and white. It just is the way. The older you get, the more nuances that you can see, and the more shades of grey that you can see. So when you're doing graduate interviewing and you see somebody that has got shades of grey, it's so refreshing and it's so encouraging, and it's actually likely the person that you're going to take onto your graduate program because you can see that they're already ahead of their peer group. So you might pick a controversial topic and you might say, what do you think of fox hunting? And 19 out of 20 graduates will give you a very firm view, and most graduates are very pro-animals and anti-animal cruelty, and most therefore will say, oh, fox hunting is abhorrent, it should be banned, So then you give the counter-argument that perhaps farmers would give, which is, well, the fox that came into my yard at the weekend just killed 100 chickens, so should I have killed the one fox, or is it okay, which is worth more to an animal lover, 100 chickens or one fox? And you then start getting into the shades of grey, and the person that can handle that kind of debate is the more mature person.
I often feel like I often have said that I only wish I knew as much as I thought I did when I graduated, and that was 40 years ago. But another one we hear a lot about is low carb, and low carb means lots of different things to lots of people. I know I went onto the USDA site for health practitioners, advice for health practitioners, and put in my weight and height and activity level and all of that, and it came back telling me that I should be eating 350 to 420 grams of carbohydrates a day, and I should be avoiding cholesterol at all costs. And this was 2019, mind you. So low carb means lots of different things to lots of people. What does low carb mean to you?
Yeah, well, I think the really helpful paper in this respect is the one that Prof. Noakes did with a guy called Jonathan Wint, and I think it was published either the back end of 2016 or 2017, but you could put them into PubMed and find the paper. And they had a little table where they defined low carb, and if I can remember, I think, I know this bit, so they defined moderate carb as 130 grams of carbohydrate a day, and then I think they defined very low carb as sort of 30 to 50 grams, and then low carb as that sort of range in between. So I think maybe low carb was under 100 or something. I don't have the figures exactly in front of me.
But that's good. I mean,
but
because
because
it is important,
they
isn't
put
it?
They put some definitions on it, which I think is quite important in this field. It means different things to different people. So I've just spent some time at a conference in Israel with Eric Westman, who I see as the modern leader of the low-carb movement. So if we had Banting back many, many years ago, and then Pennington in the 1950s, and then, of course, Atkins came along and resurrected the low-carb diet in the 1970s, I see Eric Westman as the forerunner of this current modern movement. He was the one who wrote the revised Atkins revolution. And Eric will say low carb is 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrate, and don't count net carbs, count carbohydrate. And he has this lovely little sound bite where he says, if you need to count carbs, you need to count carbs. And I mean carbs, not net carbs. So that really is, I think, it's the ketogenic level of carbohydrate counting. It's the level most likely to reverse or put type 2 diabetes into remission. But then Dr. David Cavan has been having great success over in Bermuda, just trying to get their catastrophic type 2 diabetes epidemic under control just by taking people under 100 carbs, 100 grams of carbs a day, because, of course, they're living on fruits and yams and very heavily carbohydrate-based food over in their local area and drinking fruit juice and fizzy drinks by the bucket load.
What's the difference between carbs and net carbs? I mean, I haven't really made that distinction.
Yeah, so if you put in nuts, for example, on a nutrition database, and I don't know, a nut might contain 20% carbohydrate, and 10% of that they might say is fiber, so it can't be counted, or it doesn't have to be counted. Yep. And of course the immediate question is, well, why doesn't it have to be counted? Are you seriously trying to tell me that the body, or the fiber in vegetables, the body does not register in any way? You're dicing with numbers. I'm with Eric on this one. If you've got to count carbs, you've got to count carbs. So I see people who say that they're counting carbohydrates, but they're trying to eat high fiber things, including flax seeds and nuts, which are very calorific. And the interesting thing about nuts, in the diet books that I wrote, the really interesting thing about nuts and seeds is that they have very high levels of both fat and carbohydrate, and that is unique in the real food world. So nature tends to provide carb proteins, which are grains, legumes, fruits and vegetables, or fat proteins, which are meat, fish, eggs and dairy. Nature really doesn't often put fat and carb in the same foods. That's what the food manufacturers have worked out. We find irresistible. We can't stop eating it. We want more of it. And that's why cookies, ice cream, cakes, biscuits, muffins are all based on combinations of fat and carbohydrate at a crazy level. Now, the fake food of the real food world, in my view, is nuts. Because put a bowl of cashews in front of an average person, let alone when you really make it difficult and you put salt on them, and most people just keep eating the bowl. They just have no limit. And that's the fat-carb combo. We have a limit when it comes to eating natural food that is fat protein or carb protein. But the minute we start mixing fat and carb, which is why I say to guys, just don't have chips with your steak. Have steak and salad, or have chips with a veggie curry, but don't mix your fats and carbs, because you will have no limit in terms of satiability as soon as you start doing that.
That's so interesting. I've never really thought of it like that, but yeah, that's a really good one. Listen, another one that I wanted to throw out to you, because I've been interested in nutrition for a really long time, and I just can't believe that this is so new, and that is this time restricted eating. And I know it's been around for 5, maybe 10 years, but I think that's relatively new. What do you think? Time restricted eating and fasting. What are your thoughts?
The evidence just isn't there. If you go looking for it, it isn't compelling. There's little bits that are starting to come through. I did a note on it a little while ago. There'd been a study that was it was quite an interesting study, and it looked at giving people exactly the same kind of food. And I think one of the groups was fed within a 12 or 18-hour window, and the other was fed within a 6-hour window. And they'd measured tiny differences in markers, which is all that you can do in a randomized controlled trial. You won't get serious outcomes. An outcome would be a diagnosis of a disease or a death. You couldn't do that kind of test, or you'd have to do it over several years to get that kind of outcome measure. So I think it's starting to be tested more and more, and I think evidence might come through, but I'm not persuaded of it yet. And I think it then goes back to being an individual. When the 5-2 diet first came out in the UK, and it was billed as you could eat what you want for 5 days and then just be really, really, really strict for 2 days. And of course it's not. You can't eat what you want for 5 days. The reality of that diet is you eat in a restricted way for 5 days and then you eat in a super, super restricted way for 2 days. But I remember journalists phoning me up for a quote, and I said, look, I did that when I was a teenager. It's just it was called bulimia back then. It's really dangerous, I think, for people who've had eating disorders, or for people who have a less than healthy relationship with food, which is almost everyone I've ever met, to be honest, particularly women. Most people are... There's almost nobody that can just have a completely relaxed relationship with food. There's either something you don't like from childhood, or there's something that you know makes you feel bad, or you're counting calories, which I hate, or you're counting carbohydrates, which I just wish people didn't have to count anything. Most people have some kind of weird relationship with food at the moment, and putting an extra restriction on top. When I see we've got an online club forum where we try to help people who are trying to eat real food, try to help them to get off junk food and overcome sugar addiction and carb addiction, and just give support to each other. And when I see people that I know have had problems with food saying, oh, I'm going to try fasting for a couple of days, it's like, you just know what you're going to do on the day that you go back to eating food, because you're going to have a massively disproportionate impact on your blood glucose levels almost immediately. The body's going to have no glucose, let's say, for a day, and then suddenly you have even an apple and you've got 3 times the entire glucose in the bloodstream being chucked in with just one apple. I mean, what on earth is the body going to do? Whoa, we had nothing, and then suddenly we've got all this sugar, and the body tries to get it out of the bloodstream and maybe does it too well, and then blood glucose goes lower than normal, and then you want something else. And hypoglycemia is a big driver of overeating and food cravings. And of course, it's driven by having too much glucose in the first place. So when you say to people, do you find when you have carbohydrates, a biscuit, or start the day with cereal, you just can't stop? And they say, yeah, I have a biscuit and then I want another one. I have a chocolate bar, I then want another one. It's because your blood glucose went lower than normal because it was trying to get the glucose out from the first biscuit. And as soon as it's lower than normal, you want another biscuit. And then the same thing happens again. And the only thing that breaks the cycle is that you fall asleep in this carbohydrate stupor, and you probably have not a very good sleep because your blood sugar's all over the place. And then you wake up the next morning, and most people then repeat the whole thing again, having cereal and orange juice and fruit for breakfast, and then a snack mid-morning, and pasta salad, and all the things we're told to have for the rest of the day. We just...
Well, I think if we follow the food pyramid or the dietary guidelines, and we then embark on a on time restricted eating or fasting, then we are doomed to failure. I think from my reading of it, we have to segue through the low carb, sort of give ourselves a few weeks at least of low carb eating before we'd even contemplate that, because to go down the dietary guidelines into intermittent fasting is a recipe for disaster. But listen, you've looked at so many different things. Now I wondered if we might leave our listener with a couple of tips. I mean, given everything you've read and studied over many years, and now this PhD, which I can just imagine you've kind of had to elevate randomized control studies to this the pinnacle of research. But putting even that aside, what are some tips you would give to our listener who's seeking some clarity in this fog of dietary advice?
My dietary advice has become incredibly simple. I mean, I just wish every government would just rip up every document they've ever published on diet and health, because you only need 3 rules, basically. Number 1 is eat real food.
Yep.
And you get some really stupid people going, oh, what's real food? It's like that oranges grow on trees, cartons of orange juice don't. Fish swim in the sea, fish breaded fingers don't. It's really not difficult. You can actually explain it to a 5-year-old, because I did when my niece was 5 years old. So number 1, eat real food. We should be able to agree on that if we can get the conflicts out of the way. Number 2 then is choose, because we agree, the vegans and the carnivores agree on number 1. They should do anyway. Number 2 then is choose that real food for the nutrients it provides. And that then drives you to eat animal foods. Because when you make a list of what we need, what are essential nutrients, so that's essential amino acids, complete protein, essential fats, the omega-3, omega-6, in the right form for the body, the vitamins and the minerals in the right form, the most absorbable form, what the body wants. You can put together your own table. I've done it on blogs on my website. And you can put up a vegetable, a fruit, a healthy whole grain, a legume, and then put up meat, put up liver, because it is the single most nutritious food on the planet, put up oily fish, put up eggs, put up dairy, and just compare those nutrients against those foods. And then just show the table to people and say, if you are choosing real food for the nutrients it provides, what would you choose? And there is no way you can answer vegetables, fruits, carbs, grains, legumes. You just can't. The answer can only be, I would eat offal, I would eat red meat over white meat because it's more nutritious, I would eat oily fish over even white fish, it's more nutritious, and eggs and dairy, and you'd eat full-fat dairy, not low-fat dairy. And the decision is then made for you because the evidence tells you what the most nutritious foods are. And then my 3rd rule would be eat 3 times a day maximum. Some people don't like breakfast, that's fine, eat twice a day. But I say at conferences, unless you are a cow or want to be the size of one, stop grazing, because we just eat the whole damn time. And how we are ever supposed to let our body break down body fat or fuel off its own reserves, or having a fat storing, fat releasing mechanism working in both ways, which is what it's designed to do. It's designed to store fat and release fat. And most people in the developed world have only got it working in, they've got the switch stuck on one mode at the moment, which is fat storing, and they've just got to stop eating so often. It doesn't mean you need to fast for a day, but once you've had your dinner, that's it. And if you can extend your overnight fast, that's where the evidence, I think, is starting to show that there might be something in a 12-hour overnight fast. If nothing else, it just gives your digestive system a rest. It just lets you digest your food before you sleep, so you have a better sleep. If you can finish dinner at 6 and then not have breakfast until 6 or 7 the next morning, I can't think that you're doing anything but good.
That's great. Now listen, just one last thing I wanted to ask you, and I wanted you to take a step back from your role as a researcher, author, blogger, public speaker, because we're all on this health journey together. We're all on this health journey in this modern world. What do you think the biggest challenge is for people in our modern world on their health journey?
Crikey, I think it's that they're trusting people who are not showing themselves to be trustworthy. So when we're going to go full circle here, actually, because when I said about how I started doing what I did, this is very well not planned. But when I came in and said I just couldn't understand why we had an obesity epidemic when nobody wanted to be obese, and then when you start looking at things like dietary fat and you realise that there's no evidence base for our dietary guidelines, you then start questioning everything, which is what I think people should be doing. So you look at 5 a day and you realise that it's a complete and utter fairy story. You look at the idea that 1 pound of fat equals 3,500 calories. To lose a pound of fat, you need to create a deficit of 3,500 calories. If you go on my blog, zoeharcombe.com, and put in the words "prove it" in the search box, there's a post that challenges that calorie theory. 8 glasses of water, no evidence base. Fibre, 30 grams a day, no evidence base. 30% calories from total fat, 10% from saturated fat, no evidence base. 6 to 11 servings of whole grains, whatever your Australian guidelines are, no evidence base. And then, of course, you move into the field of cholesterol, which is where we met, going through the Thinks thing. As I remember the very first time I read some work of Malcolm Kendrick's, and of course you're told that there's such a thing as good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And you just take it, you don't think about it. And then you suddenly realise that the chemical formula for cholesterol is C27H46O, and that's it. There's no good version or bad version. So you think, hang on a sec, this just doesn't make sense. So there is no good cholesterol, there's no bad cholesterol. So what is LDL cholesterol? Well, it's the cholesterol in an LDL, which is a low-density lipoprotein, which is effectively a taxi that goes around the body. And HDL cholesterol is the cholesterol in a taxi called high-density lipoprotein that's travelling around the body. So it's the same cholesterol. So why is the same cholesterol bad in one taxi and good in another taxi? That's like saying if I get in a black cab, I'm a good person, and if I get in an Uber cab, I'm a bad person. I'm the same person. How does that work? And then you start challenging everything in a whole other field. And it just every field that you look at in health, medicine, food, we have been told a whole heap of nonsense. I mean, you look at so-called normal blood pressure. So-called normal blood pressure, if you look at the actual evidence, is about 140/90. And they'll tell you that that's high blood pressure and start putting you on blood pressure meds. But that's actually entirely normal. That is the population norm. That is what norm is. It's the middle of the normal distribution in a normal population. It's like they're redefining mathematics. They're saying, no, that's not the norm. We're going to give you a new norm. We're going to decree that the norm is 120/80, and anyone who's above that is abnormal and therefore needs to be on medication. And who does that benefit? The people making blood pressure meds. Everything needs to be challenged. Trust no one, believe nothing, challenge everything you read. Read my blog and challenge it. That work as if I'm coming from some bias. I take nothing from no one. I have no conflicts of interest. But don't even trust me. You've got to trust no one. Work it out for yourself, because we are being fed so many lies in the interests of big organisations. We are the pawns in this massive global game of making money, and the only way we can stop it is to wise up and take ourselves out of being one of those pawns.
Zoe, what a note to finish on, and thank you so much for joining us today. We will, of course, have links to your website and I would encourage our listener to join up, because I think I said to you before we came on, your weekly your newsletters are just a separate folder where I store all this gold. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Now, as I mentioned, Zoe's website and her newsletter, which you have to subscribe to but is very worthwhile. It's full of some great information, beautifully researched and very accessible. So check out the show notes and the hyperlinks. Now, while you're checking things out, don't forget to download the Unstress app and keep up to date with all the latest episodes, the blogs, the courses and the events, because 2020 is going to be a very exciting year for us and we're wanting to share it with you. And of course, as always, I remind you to leave a review on iTunes. It helps to push us up the ratings and get our message out to a lot more people. So, until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences and conclusions.